Hello, and welcome to the chapter on relationships, chapter 7. So, some of the things that we are going to attempt to do in this chapter is to identify the different types of intimacy. A lot of people think that intimacy is about sex, but it's not just about that. And you can have intimate relationships that are platonic with friends, with family members, that are more about a connectedness and a bondedness. We're also going to conceptualize the nature of a meaningful relationship. We want to try to understand the common blocks to communication within relationships. And then we want to learn the principles of dealing with anger and conflict in relationships. We're also going to try to acquire a better understanding of gay and lesbian relationships and then provide guidelines for dealing with separation or termination of relationships, breakups, divorce, things of that nature. So there's many types of intimacy, just like there are many types of relationships. So, for example, you could have an emotional intimacy with someone you're in a relationship with, and this could be a romantic relationship, or it could be an emotional intimacy with a best friend, someone that you can be your authentic self with. You can have an intellectual intimacy with someone that you can really connect on a level where you talk about different intellectual ideas, logic, reasoning, problem solving, and that person kind of meets you on your level. You could, of course, have physical intimacy with someone in terms of affection, sex. You can have spiritual intimacy with someone. Maybe this is someone that you know from church or someone that you talk to about philosophical ideas as it relates to like the meaning of life or the reason why we're here or what happens when we die. Or you could have a type of intimate relationship that's exclusive, like a monogamous committed relationship, or non-exclusive. You can have a long-term relationship that's intimate or a brief relationship. And of course, you can have a combination of all these different things. So, intimacy, according to Erik Erikson, who is a psychologist that I believe we've talked about before, says that intimacy is really the ability to relate to one's deepest hopes and fears, to really connect to another person and to accept their need for intimacy in turn. Sometimes we get put off by someone that feels like they need us, right? But if you're able to be truly intimate with someone, then you accept that that's part of the human experience, is a need to connect with people on a deep, vulnerable level. He says that in a romantic relationship, intimacy should include a mutuality of orgasm with a loved partner. And he says that in any relationship that you consider to be intimate, there should be trust. So you should be able to trust the person and they should be able to trust you. So Erikson says that one of the things that we really want to see in intimate relationships as people is solidarity. And this is a kind of a personality style of people that are able to commit themselves in concrete affiliations and partnerships. So it includes the ethical strength necessary to uphold the commitment, even when that means great sacrifice or compromise on our part. That might include doing selfless acts for the other person, putting the other person's wants or needs before your own, when appropriate, not all the time, of course. And then Erikson also points out that we have the ability to distantiate from others. If you've heard people say, like, I don't need anyone or I don't trust anyone, this is really a good example of someone who has this attitude of distantiation. So, distantiation is the readiness of all of us to distance ourselves from others, especially when we feel threatened by their behavior. So, it's really the opposite of intimacy. And so most people that are in their early 20s, according to Erikson, kind of go back and forth between wanting intimacy and also kind of this need for distantiation or this need for an independence and a non-reliance on other people. And so that's normal in young adulthood because we need social distance to kind of help us to develop our identities. However, if we are always going to have this attitude of distantiation, it can lead to isolation, which is something that we really want to avoid, which is the readiness of all of us to isolate ourselves from others when we feel threatened by their behavior. So, in other words, this is a more extreme version of distantiation. So we want to be able to connect to other people and have relationships that are meaningful. It's part of our need as human beings. So let's talk now about meaningful relationships. So, as we go through the different characteristics of meaningful relationships, it's important to apply these characteristics to several different relationships in your life, not just your romantic relationships. So, consider your relationships with your coworkers, your parents, your friends, your siblings, and of course, if you have a romantic relationship, that as well. And you also want to keep in mind that your culture affects what characteristics you consider to be meaningful in a relationship, and adapt these ideas that we're talking about to fit your values. And then also you want to remember that all relationships will experience good times and bad times. Relationships ebb and flow. Like we've talked about before, it's not just the Disney ideal of happily ever after. So people who accept this tend to have better relationships in the long run. So if as we're going through these characteristics, you feel like right now in your relationship you're not able to check every single box, that's normal and that's okay. And that will hopefully get better over time and then change again as relationships naturally do. So the first characteristic that we're going to talk about in terms of a meaningful relationship, you could also kind of look at this as a healthy relationship, characteristics of a healthy relationship. So each person in the relationship has a separate identity. There needs to be a balance between togetherness and separateness. If we don't have enough togetherness, then people in the relationship feel alone and they're less likely to disclose vulnerable feelings and thoughts, and then there's like a lack of connectedness. But if we don't have enough separateness, then people lose their sense of self and they're more willing to conform to what their partner wants them to be rather than who they actually are. So we do need to find that balance. And then another characteristic is that each person in the relationship should be able to give and receive honest and respectful feedback. We can't expect people to be psychic and know what we want. We have to tell them what we want. And when we do communicate feedback to our people in our relationships, we need to make sure that we use what are called I statements instead of you statements. So I feel sad when you ignore my text messages, not you never text me back. When we start our statements with you, it causes people to be defensive and less open to listen to our feedback. And so we also need to, in turn, be open to the feedback that we are receiving. If we become defensive and aggressive, then the person in the relationship with us is going to be scared to talk to us. And communication is obviously key to a successful relationship, so we don't want that. We also need to assume responsibility for our own happiness. Of course, the way someone else feels and behaves is going to affect our happiness, but really we can choose how to react to it. So you are responsible for your own happiness, for your dreams, and for your goals. It's unrealistic to expect someone else to make you happy. It just doesn't work that way. You have to make yourself happy. And if someone else is kind of always bummed out and always depressed or always angry, then you have to figure out how to react to that in a way that's not going to affect your happiness. And then finally, people in meaningful relationships are willing to work at keeping the relationship healthy. So both people have to invest in the relationship, be willing to put the work in, and give each other the time and attention necessary for the relationship to be a success. Other characteristics of meaningful relationships include that each person in the relationship should enjoy spending time together and are able to have fun and play together, be silly, take the time to enjoy the other person as they are. Don't expect or want them to be something else. And then finding mutual interest can really help increase the enjoyment that you're having when spending time with someone you're in a relationship with. And then if it is asexual or romantic relationship, assume responsibility for the sexual enjoyment of the relationship. Be able to express your sexual needs and wants, be able to communicate that. Be sure to maintain a culture of emotional closeness, support, and romance. So sex is something that goes hand in hand with emotions, and if there is a lack of emotion in a romantic sexual relationship, then the sex tends to suffer. And then also be willing to ask your partner what they want sexually and help to meet their needs as well. Another characteristic is that both people are equal in the relationship. Some people feel like they are givers, but then when they need help, like the other person isn't there. And some people feel like they are the strong one, so it isn't their role to ask someone for help. But regardless of how these people feel in the relationships, they need to be reciprocal. So you need to feel like you are getting back what you give into the relationship. Otherwise, we build resentments and we carry these grudges with us. So it's important that we communicate with our partners what it is that we need to feel like we're on the same level. And then people in meaningful relationships, they find meaning outside of the relationship. They don't put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. We have to let our partner explore other avenues of life so that they can have a full and fulfilled life. We can't be possessive of our partners or act as if we own them. And it's not healthy to ask people to deny their wants or feelings or needs for you. If you love someone, you want the best for them. And so you want them to have a fulfilled life and, you know, participate in their hobbies or things that they enjoy doing. And sometimes those are things that happen outside of the relationship. And then each person also needs to kind of be moving in a direction in life that is personally meaningful to them. So each person really needs to have a direction. We need to have our own goals, hobbies, and relationships outside of the person that we're in a relationship with. We can't like rely on them to fulfill our every need in life. And also, if you don't have any goals or hobbies, what are you bringing to the relationship? It's difficult to have a relationship with someone who has like nothing to offer. Okay, also a characteristic of a meaningful relationship is that people maintain the commitment by choice. They make the choice to remain in the relationship because they want to, not because they have to or because they're complacent and they're comfortable and they're scared to leave. People that are in relationships want to be there and they want to stay together even in tough times and work through it. So, commitment, as defined by our textbook, is the choice to stay in a relationship even though difficulties and challenges may and most likely will arise. So, also in meaningful relationships, the people are able to deal with conflict. We can't expect that there's not going to be conflict. I mean, I know for myself, I have conflicts with myself, right? So how can we not disagree or question or challenge the person that we're in a relationship with? We're just not always going to see things the exact same way. But the important thing is that we solve conflicts respectfully and learn from them. And then also, we shouldn't need or expect the other person to do for us what we can do for ourselves. So don't ask the other person to take away your boredom or make you feel important or take over your problems. We shouldn't need the other person to make us feel worthy or to validate us. And a good thing to kind of keep in mind is that happiness is contagious. So make yourself happy, and it usually rubs off on the people around you. And you also need to work on your self-esteem by yourself. You also need to validate yourself. You shouldn't need any outside source to do that for you. And then when we are in a meaningful relationship, we should be encouraging the other person to reach their full potential. So if we're in a relationship with someone that is intimidated by our personal successes or growths, that's generally not a sign of a healthy relationship. Okay, so let's watch a video now on what helps relationships to succeed and what research shows are some factors involved with relationships failing.
Relationships are terrifying. I mean, did you know half of all marriages last forever? Hello, loves. Julian here for D News. All right, first of all, the oft-quoted statistic that 50% of marriages fail is just plain wrong. The actual number for first marriages is closer to 20 to 25%. But that still begs the question, why do they fail? Why do people who have avowed themselves to one another for their whole lives come up short? Well, John and Julie Gottman have been pondering that question for decades. By the way, they're both psychologists, and yes, they're married. Feel free to daw now. According to the Gottmans, you can actually predict with 94% certainty which relationships will be healthy and which will be festering quagmires of misery and stress simply by how they support each other. Anyone who's been in a relationship knows that sometimes you and your partner's interests don't align. Maybe you like hockey, but they're not so hot in it. Or maybe they like camping, and you understandably think sleeping on the dirty ground in the woods with no Wi-Fi is a terrible way to spend a vacation. But when one person tries to share their interests with their significant other, that's a bid for emotional support. How often they get that acknowledgement makes all the difference. John Gottman conducted a study where he invited 130 newlywed couples to what looked like a bed and breakfast, but was actually a lab where they could observe the subjects. He was watching for how often one person would say something seemingly inconsequential, like, "Hey, check out that bird," or "I have the weirdest feeling we're being watched right now." Gottman called these bids for emotional support and noted how often their partner would respond in a meaningful way. Their findings show that couples stay together when they show bids of interest or support 9 out of 10 times, while couples who only support each other 1/3 of the time split within 6 years. Ignoring those bids for support and acceptance can have an actual physiological effect. The Gottmans and a team of researchers brought in newlyweds to interview them. They were asked some pretty tough questions on their relationships while electrodes monitored their heart rates, blood flow, and sweatiness. While across the board everyone responded calmly to the questions, some couples showed higher heart rates, blood flow, and sweat production. In other words, their palms were sweaty, knees weak, arms were heavy, they're nervous, but on the surface they look calm and ready. The stress of being in the same room as their spouse and talking about their relationship caused their sympathetic nervous system to kick in, and they had a fight or flight response. Those couples were usually divorced within 6 years. So if you want to have a healthy and less stressful relationship, it's important you both work actively to support each other's emotional bids, even if camping is just the worst. If you want to learn another trick to keep the fire lit, check out Anthony's explanation of how texting can ruin a relationship over here. What do you think the key is to living happily ever after? Tell us your secret in the comments, and I'll see you next time on D News.
Okay, for lecture activity 1 for this chapter, which is chapter 7, I would like for you to think of the relationship that you have in your life that is the most meaningful. And remember, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could be with a family member, a coach, a coworker, anybody in your life. And I want you to tell me why you think that's the most meaningful relationship using some of the characteristics that we've already talked about. So choose 3 of the characteristics that we've talked about over the last couple of slides when we were describing meaningful relationships, and then give me examples of how your meaningful relationship meets those 3 characteristics. So for example, if you say that you are in a meaningful relationship with your cousin, and one of the characteristics that you guys have is that you enjoy spending time together, then, give me an example of the things that you do when you spend time together and how you feel you can be open with that person and silly and goof around. And so you're going to do that for 3 of the characteristics to help kind of get a better idea of why your relationship constitutes a healthy and meaningful one. So anger can take many forms. It can be more obvious or more subtle. It could be irritation, resistance, annoyance, frustration, or it could be flat out rage. So the expressions of anger that we observe as children tend to shape the way we express our anger as adults. So if your parents yelled when they were angry, it's likely that you will yell when you are angry. If your parents internalized their anger and just kind of did the silent treatment, then that's probably how you deal with anger. But nevertheless, it's important to choose your battles So we don't want to just like nitpick and argue about everything in a relationship. We want to know when to give people a break because they're sick or having a bad day. But we also don't want to hold all of our irritations in. So it really is about knowing when it's appropriate to talk about what's making you angry and when it's not. So when you do express your anger, talk about the behavior rather than attacking the person's character. Be careful about saying things like, you always do this, or you never do that, or this is just how you are. But instead, talk about the specific thing that made you angry. It made me angry that, I was waiting for you to pick me up after school and you were 15 minutes late. And leave it at that rather than starting in an attack on who the person is. And then after you have expressed your anger, don't beat the person over the head with it. You've gotten it out, let it go. Try not to hold on to it if possible. You can still deal with the issue and still try to find a resolution, but that feeling of anger, we really don't want it to fester inside of us. It's not very healthy. And when people do hold on to their anger, it usually leads to reflexive and destructive communication patterns. So the idea is that it kind of just snowballs and builds on itself. Where if you're angry at someone, it's like no matter what they say, you're just going to kind of snap at them without even thinking. And this becomes very destructive to a relationship. So, um, when you're in a relationship and you're dealing with anger, just keep in mind some of these tips that you see here on the slide. Value the recognition and expression of anger. Don't, be afraid to say, like, hey, this made me angry. But when you do express anger, don't attack the person. Don't hold on to anger and nurse grudges. Try to use those I statements so that you're talking more about yourself rather than attacking the person. And again, choose your battles. Decide when it's better not to express anger. And also try to recognize danger signs. Like if the person is not sober, it might not be a good idea to let them know what they did last week that pissed you off. And also, if they seem to have a temper that is violent, these are definitely danger signs that require a little bit more attention and maybe a different strategy. Okay, so let's watch a video on anger and conflict in relationships.
Why does your relationship get stuck? What happens when your relationship gets stuck in a negative cycle? Over time, we start fighting, bickering, criticizing, fault-finding, shaming, blaming, and more, which if not resolved, becomes more frequent and toxic. What's really going on is emotional needs are not being met in some way. In other words, feeling invisible, unheard, unloved, unappreciated, etc. We start to question where our relationship and life is going. We find ways of coping or avoiding the situation, such as work, hobbies, sport, addictions, affairs, illness, etc. If this cycle is not addressed and resolved where both partners' needs are taken into account, the risk is a toxic downward spiral that can lead to divorce or breakup. Connection disappears, conflict starts, and negativity sets in. So what's the answer? Stop fighting and start talking. Communication equals connection. When we feel connected, we feel safe, loved, cared for, happy, and fulfilled. You can only do this if you create a safe space for both of you to express your needs and feelings with each other. The real shift will come when you start taking action each day to eliminate the negative and focus on the positive in your relationship. Lift each other up daily in a positive way. Create a relationship vision together and steps to achieve it. Couples that grow together, stay together. Book a consultation with Paula now. Get your copy of Embracing Conflict at Amazon.
There are certain communication barriers or patterns that can really have a negative impact on a relationship and potentially even cause it to deteriorate. So, communication barriers are factors that get in the way of effective interpersonal relating. And by knowing what they are, you can intervene and stop the pattern. So there's 4 of them that are sometimes called the 4 horsemen, and they're especially dangerous, and we want to look out for them. So the first one is criticism, which is verbal fault finding, such as commenting on a character flaw in the partner. So this is not to be confused with complaining, which is, healthy. Complaining is expressing an unmet need, something a person desires but is not receiving from a partner. And when complaining doesn't result in healthy communication, that's when resentment builds, and then that's when criticism usually starts. So if you're using those you statements rather than those I statements that we've talked about, then you've really most likely moved from complaining to criticizing. And the next communication barrier is contempt, which is disrespect, disgust, or hate expressed when the positive feelings partners once had for each other have dissipated. So contempt develops from criticism, and it's really characterized by this feeling of disgust, of not respecting your partner, or in extreme cases, even hating your partner. And criticism focuses on what a person does, but contempt focuses on who a person is. So when you have contempt for someone, comments are usually intended to hurt that person and cause them pain, using information that really only an intimate partner would know. Some of the tactics that we see when people are engaging in contempt is name calling, mocking, sarcasm, painful insults. And one of the things that you can see is contempt on someone's face. They actually kind of curl their upper lip. The next one is defensiveness, and defensiveness allows each partner to deny responsibility, which really makes resolution of the conflict impossible. And defensiveness develops from contempt. Some of the tactics that we see in defensiveness are denying responsibility, making excuses, blaming external forces, disagreeing with all complaints, cross-complaining, which is where someone expresses their complaint to you and you just hit them back with your complaint, kind of a one-for-one, tat-for-tat. And then repeating your position over and over and over again. So again, like kind of beating someone over the head with your point of view. And then the last one is stonewalling. And so stonewalling is kind of the worst of all of them. It's relying on a passive form of power and aggression by being unresponsive when disagreements and disputes erupt. It develops from criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. And what it really says to the person is, I don't care enough about this relationship or you to even try to work this out. And usually when people get to the stage of stonewalling, it ends in a breakup. It doesn't have to. I mean, you can still bounce back from that, but usually that is a very big red flag that we need to fix the communication, or it's likely that this relationship would just end. So conflict can be very uncomfortable. I mean, usually it's pretty awkward, and most people don't enjoy conflict or confrontation. And there's like a lot of people in relationships that will say, oh, we never fight. But actually, conflict can be a healthy sign in a relationship. It can be a healthy sign that there are individual differences, that you're not just giving in to what your partner wants, or that they're not just giving in to you, but rather you've still maintained your own separate identity, so you have something to offer one another. And it's just important to keep in mind that it's okay to have a different opinion than your partner. And sometimes you need to be able to just agree to disagree, especially if there's no negative consequence of agreeing to disagree. If you just, one of you thinks the Chargers is the best football team and someone else thinks the Patriots is the best football team, there's really no need for you to agree on that. You can just agree to disagree, and it's not going to impact your life in a negative way, hopefully. And then see confrontation as a caring act. So you can kind of just like change your perspective on conflict and confrontation, and understand that really the opposite of love is not hate or anger, but it's indifference. It's when someone just stops caring. So if someone has enough invested in the relationship to confront you, even though it's most likely uncomfortable for them, and they know it's going to make you uncomfortable, this at least shows that they are still caring about the relationship. So have a respectful conversation and try to maintain a loving attitude during a confrontation, and practice empathy. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand where they're coming from. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything or really anything they're saying, but you can at least try to see it from their perspective, which might help to like calm you down and allow you to listen and maybe be more open to a resolution. And then you want to resist the temptation to plan your next response while the other person is speaking. So it's common for us in all conversations that when someone is talking, we're thinking about what we're going to say when they finish talking. But the problem is that with that is that then you're not listening to what they're saying. So you want to listen to what the other person is saying instead of focusing on like trying to win the argument. Instead, focus on trying to understand where the other person's coming from. And then it's also good to identify your motivation when you're in a conflict, especially if you're the person that kind of initiates it. Make sure that your intentions are good, that your intentions are to improve the relationship, that your intentions are not to punish the other person or express some type of dominance or power or control over them, but that instead all you're trying to do is make the relationship healthier and happier for both of you. And sometimes it's helpful to just straight up clarify your intentions. Tell the person that your intentions are to better the relationship and not to tear them down. Sometimes this can kind of, take them off of the defense. If you are on the receiving end of the confrontation and it feels like the person, that their motivation is to kind of like degrade or demean or exert power over you, then ask them what their intention is. Like what are you hoping to get out of this conflict? What's your intention behind it? Why are you bringing it up? What would you hope the resolution to this is? And then also you want to accept responsibility for your own feelings. Sometimes my dad used to always say to me, you always hurt the ones you love. And it's true. Sometimes when we're in a really comfortable relationship with someone, if we get irritated at our boss or at a friend, we'll take it out on the person that we're in the comfortable relationship with because we can count on them to forgive us or to love us unconditionally. So when you're mad at someone, try to identify the true source of your feelings. Am I really mad at this person, or am I upset about something else and taking it out on this person? And then the next one is try to not make dogmatic statements. Don't tell the person all the things that they are doing wrong. Instead, tell them how their actions make you feel in a very specific way. And also, it's good to tell others how you are struggling with them. So give them specific examples of actions that hurt you, not like broad general statements or giving them the silent treatment, but tell them exactly what they did that hurt you so that they can understand where you're coming from. And then finally, don't walk away from conflict. Of course, if the confrontation gets too escalated, take a break, but it's important to revisit the issue until there is some type of resolution once everyone's like a little bit calmer. So when it comes to forgiveness and letting go of anger, we have to recognize that in a relationship that's worth maintaining to us, forgiveness is going to be a part of the equation, and it's going to go in both directions. We are going to have to forgive others sometimes when they hurt us, and we're going to have to ask for forgiveness when the people that we love have been hurt by us. So it's important to keep in mind that no one is perfect. If you're in a long-term relationship with someone, especially, it's likely that at some point you're going to hurt them. And being too prideful to admit when you are wrong or not asking for forgiveness hurts intimacy. So sometimes people feel like there is like this unequal balance of power where they somehow are superior to the person that they're in the relationship with, and therefore they should never have to ask for forgiveness. But this is not healthy. There needs to be equality in the relationship, like we talked about. And so there are going to be times where you're wrong. And it's important in those times to ask for forgiveness and not be too prideful or too full of your ego to say like, hey, I'm human. I messed up and I realize that I hurt you and I feel bad about that, and I want to, rectify the situation and hopefully you can forgive me and we can get past this. It's also important that you are able to forgive yourself when you hurt someone else. Some people have a really hard time with forgiving themselves. They hold on to those feelings of shame and remorse and guilt. But it's important to recognize again that that's just part of the human experience. No one's perfect. No one's going to get out of this without making mistakes in relationships. And so when you hurt someone, you just need to learn from it and then move on. The only reason that you should feel like a lingering sense of shame is if you don't learn anything from it. But as long as you learn something from the mistake and move on, then that's just part of life. It's normal, and there's really no reason to beat yourself up about it forever. So there are 4 steps to genuine self-forgiveness. The first one is responsibility. Accept that you made a mistake. Like, you did it. It's on you. You're bad. And then 2, allow yourself to feel remorse. So allow yourself to truly feel sorry for the actions that you've done that have hurt the other person. And the third step is restoration, and this is where you make amends with the person that you've hurt. So if you've hurt them and it has resulted in a conflict, then you want to go to that person and again ask for forgiveness, acknowledge that you made a mistake, let them know that you feel remorse for that, and that that's not something you want to do again in the future. And hopefully you can restore the relationship back to how it was before the argument. And in some cases actually people tend to get closer after a confrontation because they kind of realize that like you can get through things and still love each other. And then the last step in genuine self-forgiveness is to get over it. Move on, let it go. It happened, it's behind you. No amount of thinking about it or feeling sorry about it is going to change anything in the past or affect anything in the future. So to just continue to hold on to it ultimately will hurt you and potentially can hurt the relationship as you're kind of constantly focused on this shame and guilt. It's going to be hard to be a happy, loving, healthy person if that's where you're kind of at mentally. And then conversely, refusing to forgive someone and holding grudges also hurts intimacy. So, like, you don't have to forgive and then immediately forget. It's a process, right? So, it takes time to really forgive someone and to really move on from something. And you have to give yourself that time to do that. But holding on to resentment, when you hold that grudge for too long, or it does become a feeling of resentment that you're holding on to, it keeps your body in a state of fight or flight, which is physically damaging to you and psychologically unhealthy. It creates a stress that's just too much for your body to handle. So it's important to forgive others and allow yourself the time to go through that process. Okay, for lecture activity 2, I'd like for you to tell me if you think it's possible to truly forgive and forget when it comes to someone that you're in a relationship with hurting you. Once that person has hurt you, can you truly forgive and forget? So I want you to just respond to that question in 2 to 3 sentences and explain why you have the belief that you have. So now we're going to talk about intimate partner violence and abuse. Sometimes it's referred to as domestic abuse. And so just to get a clear understanding of what this is, it's physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, or economic abuse by a partner or a spouse. And what it involves is exerting power and control over others. That's what it's really about. And so abusers tend to use tactics that try to increase their victims' dependence, like isolating them from other people so that, telling them like they can't go out with their friends, or being financially in total control and having like one bank account that the other person in the relationship doesn't have access to, for example. So, if you are in an abusive relationship, then you really want to exercise great caution in how you interact with your partner. It may not ever be safe to be vulnerable with this person. So, like all the things that we've talked about when it comes to intimacy and vulnerability and forgiveness and letting go, kind of don't necessarily apply in this situation. Maybe some to a certain extent, but definitely you need to be way more cautious in how you handle relationships when there's violence or any type of abuse involved. So one of the things that we see happen commonly is that victims of abuse rationalize their choice to stay and excuse their partner's behavior. And they do this in different ways. They may blame themselves for the abuse or downplay the severity of the situation. Or, it's common for the partner to like promise that they're going to change. And so the person that is the victim of the abuse may believe this, that their partner is actually going to change, even though there is this cycle of abuse that tends to kind of repeat itself over and over. So the cycle of abuse is a repetitive pattern of stages that defines most abusive and violent relationships, and it cycles through the honeymoon stage, then to the tension building phase, then the explosion of violence, followed by a return to that honeymoon stage, and then the beginning of a new cycle. So the cycle happens over time, which kind of can make it difficult to identify when it started or what stage of it you're in. Abuse is usually not constant, so weeks may go by without any abuse. And most relationships start in the honeymoon phase, but this eventually ends with time, even in healthy relationships. And then in abusive relationships, like when conflicts occur, there's no rational problem solving, and one person just gives in to the other to kind of maintain harmony. Whereas with healthy relationships, there's communication and resolution when a conflict occurs. So in these abusive relationships, tension will continue in what's called the tension building phase, and then that usually results in abusive or violent explosions. And again, the abused person kind of does whatever they can to calm the situation, and then this leads to that honeymoon phase, which occurs after the violence, where the abuser usually apologizes, buys gifts, or they may just deny the abuse altogether. Victims usually hope that the honeymoon phase will last and usually convince themselves that the abuse is over and that it will get better. So a lot of people have a difficult time understanding why a victim of abuse would stay in a relationship. And there are a lot of reasons why, but we're going to watch a video that kind of explains this in more detail.
I'm here today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell. I was 22. I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. My secret was that I had this gun, loaded with hollow point bullets, pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate, many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor. I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. I spent most of my career working for Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Leo Burnett, and the Washington Post. I've been married for almost 20 years to my second husband, and we have 3 kids together. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me. But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages. And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners, boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me 2 things. One was that he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore, and he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job, but I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, you know that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe? He bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy. He needed them to feel protected. But those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries. denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave? I was able to leave because of one final sadistic beating that broke through my denial. I realized that the man who I loved so much was going to kill me if I let him. So I broke the silence. I told everyone. The police, my neighbors, my friends and family, total strangers. And I'm here today because you all helped me. We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying, as if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me, because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab, and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves. Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it. We victims need everyone. We need every one of you to understand the secrets of domestic violence. Show abuse the light of day by talking about it with your children, your coworkers, your friends and family. Recast survivors as wonderful, lovable people with full futures. Recognize the early signs of violence and conscientiously intervene, de-escalate it, show victims a safe way out. Together, we can make our beds, our dinner tables, and our families the safe and peaceful oases they should be. Thank you.
Okay, so there are some other communication barriers that negatively impact our relationships. So here are some like the top 4 major communication barriers. The first one is hearing only what you want to hear. So viewing the conversation as a logical argument and nitpicking the weak points of the person's argument. When you're in like a interpersonal, intimate relationship with someone, it's not really the time to practice like your debate skills or your like argumentation and rhetoric skills. So instead, try to understand the person's main point, and ask for clarification if necessary. If you're confused by what they're saying, instead of telling them that their argument is weak or illogical, just try to better understand their argument. And then another communication barrier is being overly concerned with getting your point across, like includes silently rehearsing what you will say as you're listening. Again, don't try to win, try to empathize. Another common barrier is becoming overly defensive. So, overreacting, using sarcasm and hostility, and avoiding responsibility for your part. And then another common barrier is making assumptions about another person without checking those assumptions out. So, Carl Rogers is a psychologist, and he says the main barrier to effective communication is judging and evaluating everything the other person says. So rather than like trying to figure out where they're coming from or how they're feeling or what they're meaning, instead you're just like judging and evaluating and silently criticizing everything they're saying. And that's not something that we should really be doing in loving, healthy relationships. Instead, we should have that intention of improving the relationship and making the relationship better, and making sure that our partner is feeling heard and that we're feeling heard. And so by just constantly evaluating them, we're not really accomplishing those goals. So some other barriers include fearing that we will change if we listen to what our partner says. Sometimes people are worried that they're going to like lose their edge or lose some level of respect in the relationship. And so this leads people to be unwilling to empathize. But really what that is just a fear to be vulnerable. I mean, it takes courage to be vulnerable with someone. But vulnerability is a really key factor in having an intimate, connected relationship. And so if you are too afraid that empathizing with your partner and listening to them might cause you to change in some kind of way, if you're too afraid to go there, then maybe that's a sign that you need to reconsider if this relationship is really healthy overall. Because in order for you to get anything out of the relationship, you need to make sure that you can be vulnerable and intimate with that person. Okay, so the way relationships look always evolve over time. And so most recently, we've seen an evolution of kind of the way relationships develop and are maintained through the advancements in technology. So technology shapes the way people meet, the way they develop relationships, and the way that they communicate with one another. We are able to use technology such as social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to get in touch with people from our past, to network for business purposes, to meet people all over the world, and to stay knowledgeable about what our friends are up to, what they've been doing, what their hobbies are, what their interests are. And so research shows that reading an uplifting and entertaining post by someone makes us feel more connected to that person. So technology can be a wonderful tool that enhances our ability to communicate with others. It's especially helpful for people who feel uncomfortable with face-to-face interaction, or even like telephone calls, are able to use technology to open up in a way that maybe they usually wouldn't, which can be a very good thing. However, there is concern that all of this technology and social media is causing us to sacrifice the quality of our relationships for the quantity. So rather than having deep, connected, intimate relationships with a person, we're more interested in just kind of accumulating likes or followers. And so research shows that people feel more in control of the interactions that they have online, and so they're actually willing to say things that they wouldn't normally say in person. And research shows that there's a level of perceived anonymity and psychological protection that people feel online that may actually not be realistic. So when people are saying things that they wouldn't say in person, sometimes those things are not true. Sometimes those things are more self-disclosure than they would usually give, to the point of maybe being inappropriate. And research shows that Facebook may actually be causing people to be more self-absorbed, more narcissistic, more into themselves than empathetic in relationships. So kind of rather than going on the social media to give of ourselves, we're going on there to get positive feedback and to get reassurance and to get validation and to get our egos kind of fed into. And so there are many advantages to social networking, but there is also a level of risk that we take on when we disclose personal information online. For example, we know that employers and college admissions look at applicants' online posts, and there have been cases of people not getting jobs or not getting accepted to colleges or things that they're going out for because of what they have in their history on social media, pictures or comments that the hiring party feels is unacceptable. We also know that criminals use information to manipulate, coerce, blackmail others, and gain access to their personal information. So people have had, there's been many cases where people have been victims of con artists online, from pedophilia to home invasions to identity theft. And then a potential advantage of using an online dating service like Match.com or eHarmony is that it does offer a mechanism for matching for compatibility. So you can kind of put in what your interests and needs and wants are, and then it will like match you with someone that is the same as you on several different characteristics. Additionally, people report that meeting online removes the awkward getting to know you stage. And so it kind of takes the uncomfortability out of that and makes it a more streamlined and easier to manage process. An interesting thing that can happen in online relationships is that intimacy can develop more rapidly than in face-to-face relationships, resulting in something psychologists call hyper-personal relationships. And this is due to people managing the way others view them by taking extra time to construct and edit messages. So you're like, oh, this person's so clever and witty, but it took them 20 minutes to come up with that. And then research shows that breakup rates are higher for relationships that start online than offline, and part of that may be due to the lying that people do on the internet, because there is that perception of anonymity and maybe I'll never actually meet this person, so when they ask me what I do for a living, I'm a doctor. So the problem is that once we get to know that person in real life, some of those lies that they said come to surface and we find that they're not true. And so this might be one of the explanations for why there are breakups, why the rates are higher for breakups online than in person. For lecture activity 3, I'd like you to consider what we talked about when we were talking about hyper-personal relationships. And I'd also like for you to think about a couple of other things that could come from hyper-personal relationships. So kind of diving into a perceived intimacy very quickly online due to this kind of perception of anonymity or this perceived psychological safety because you're behind a computer. So give me 2 examples of how hyper-personal relationships that develop online could be problematic for a long-term relationship. So you can just give me a sentence or 2 on each. So again, 2 examples or ideas of how hyper-personal relationships online could be problematic when the relationship becomes more meaningful in the long term. Okay, so we're going to talk about gay and lesbian relationships. There's a lot of terminology that you'll need to know, but we're going to start by just delineating between heterosexual and homosexual. So heterosexual are people whose sexual desires and behaviors are directed towards members of the opposite gender. And then homosexuals are people who seek emotional and sexual relationships with same-gendered individuals. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of homosexuality in our country. So in 1969, homosexuality was actually illegal. In fact, it was even illegal to serve alcohol to homosexuals. However, there was this bar called the Stonewall Inn in New York City, and it was one of the few gay bars. However, once a month it was raided and its patrons were arrested by police. But on June 28, 1969, the patrons fought back against a police raid and a riot ensued. This riot gained national attention and it really began the gay rights movement. So now, every June, there are marches and parades that are held to commemorate Stonewall and the beginning of the gay rights movement. So we're going to watch a video on Stonewall and the riot and the birth of the gay rights movement.
Before Stonewall, there was no such thing as coming out or being out. The very idea of being out, it was ludicrous. And people talk about being in and out now. There was no out. There was just in.
In society today, there is a general acceptance for homosexuals. Same-sex marriage is legal in 11 countries, and gay pride parades are highly anticipated and held annually in the summer worldwide. How did society ever get to this point, when only 40 years ago, homosexuality was considered a mental illness? After the raid at the Stonewall Inn on July 28, 1969, and the riots following the raid, huge amounts of gays began to come together for the first time. The Stonewall riots was a turning point for Western gay liberation and is the reason homosexuals are generally accepted in society today.
And if we catch you in vow with a homosexual, your parents are going to know about it first. And you will be caught. Don't think you won't be caught. Because this is one thing you cannot get away with. This is one thing that if you don't get caught by us, you'll be caught by yourself. And the rest of your life will be a living hell.
Before the Stonewall riots, homosexuals were seen as mentally ill, immoral beings that knew not to tell their homosexuality to anyone. Homosexuals were thought to be the main culprits of child molestation, and to be found out usually resulted in imprisonment, loss of job, family, friends, sometimes suicide, and to be sent to an institution to try to be cured. Institutions attempted to cure homosexuals by showing gay males pornography while giving them electric shocks, conducting procedures or surgeries, and giving gays a drug that gives the same feeling as drowning. As a result of this, many gays turned into walking vegetables. In rural areas, there was no way to be gay and not have everyone find out, which is why many homosexuals came to big, anonymous cities like New York.
And I got to the corner of 6th Avenue and 8th Street, crossed the street, and there I had found Nirvana. There was all these drag queens and these crazy people, and everybody was carrying on. I made friends that first day.
There was one street called Christopher Street, where actually I could sit and talk to other gay people beyond just having sex.
The Madison Society was the first gay organization started in 1950 by an English-born American labor advocate, Harry Hay. They met in a place with the blinds literally drawn, afraid the FBI was after them. The Madison Society aimed to get the straight public to see homosexuals as actual people. They began to draw up a constitution and use techniques similar to the ones used during the civil rights movement. They also created the word homophile to use instead of homosexual, to put an emphasis on love rather than sex, to give gay people a different public image. In the 1960s, gay bars were the place to go for homosexuals, and the Stonewall Inn was the most popular gay bar in Greenwich Village and acted as a refuge from the harassment of everyday society for gays. Like most gay bars during this time, it was controlled by the mafia and illegally served liquor without a liquor license.
The mafia owned the jukeboxes, they owned the cigarette machines, and most of the liquor was off a truck hijacking.
It was impossible for the club to make so much money unnoticed, interesting the police highly. Although raids at Stonewall were almost routine, the night of July 28, 1969 was different. At 1:20 a.m., the peak of the merriment, the police raided Stonewall and something unexpected happened. Gays fought back.
Really unusual raid. Going in there in the middle of the night with a full crowd, the Mafia hasn't been alerted, the 6th Precinct hasn't been alerted.
A rather tough lesbian was busted in the bar, but when she came out of the bar, she was fighting the cops and was trying to get away. And the harder she fought, the more the cops were beating her up, and the madder the crowd got.
And as I'm looking around to see what's going on, police cars, different things happening, it's getting bigger by the minute.
And some people come out and were being very dramatic, throwing their arms up in a V, as the victory sign.
Things started off small, but there was an energy that began to flow through the crowd.
People were screaming, "Okay, copper." People started throwing pennies.
And then everybody started to throw pennies, like they were, this is what they were, nothing but coppers. That's what they were worth.
We had maybe 6 people, and by this time there were several thousand outside.
Called them names, telling them how good looking they were, grabbing their butts, doing things like that, just making their lives miserable for once.
For the first time, we weren't letting ourselves be carted off to jails. Gay people were actually fighting back just the way people in the peace movement fought back.
It was thrilling. It was the only time I was in gladiatorial sports that, I stood up in. I was proud. I was a man.
The riot that night changed everything. It was the first time gays had ever stood up for themselves. And the next night, people came back to riot outside of Stonewall, and several nights after that, continuing the riots for 5 days, causing many to finally come out of the closet and fight for their rights.
When it was clear that things were definitely over for the evening, we decided we needed to do something more. We knew that this was a moment that we didn't want to let slip past, because it was something that we could use to bring more of the groups together.
After Stonewall, what was called the New Homosexual was born. Activists saw this as a time to take action and form organizations like the Gay Liberation Front, which was the first organization to use gay in its title. This group wanted to align themselves with the Black Panther, civil rights, and anti-Vietnam groups. Gay Liberation Front meetings became chaotic, and many people began to disagree with them. Therefore, Moderate Liberation split off to form the Gay Activist Alliance, aiming to seek basic rights for homosexuals. This group had a firehouse in Manhattan that became the headquarters for gay movement in New York. Dances were held in the firehouse that were told to change people's lives, and had at least a couple thousand people on Saturday nights. The first Gay Pride March was held on June 28, 1970, the anniversary of Stonewall, called Christopher Street Liberation Day, also known today as Gay Pride Parades. The march started with about 100 people, but kept growing as they marched up 6th Avenue.
And I looked back, and there were about 2,000 people behind us, and that's when I knew it had happened. I say I cannot tell this without tearing up. And Peter and I walked the rest of the whole thing with tears running down our face.
In 1973, a huge accomplishment was made when Robert Spitzer concluded that homosexuality did not meet the requirements of a psychiatric disorder. Therefore, homosexuality was no longer considered a mental illness. Homosexuality started to play a part and make achievements in politics due to influential people such as Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was the first admittedly gay person to become a state representative and made national headlines when he was elected city supervisor of San Francisco in 1977. At least half of homosexuals, including Milk, had moved to San Francisco between 1969 and 1977, with assertiveness from the Stonewall riots. He encouraged all homosexuals to step out of the closet and organized the Castro Valley Association, the gay community's first independent source of political power. And then, when Harvey Milk was murdered at the peak of his popularity, people only followed his words even more. As the 1970s ended, the gay community was making massive progress, even when faced with overwhelming obstacles. When the outbreak of AIDS hit the gay community, many were shocked and afraid, especially afraid to ruin the community. However, the spread of AIDS caused the whole gay community to come out in a way. No healthcare would help until gay doctors stepped in and built organizations to help support. After Congressmember Stuart McKinley died from AIDS, other people in Congress began to come out as well. The community grew and kept growing. People began to come together more in San Francisco, forming AIDS marches and riots. AIDS forced the gay and lesbian movement to nationalize, institutionalize, and aggressively pursue the mainstream. Since then, homosexuality has made massive accomplishments to becoming the mainstream. Gay pride parades are held annually around the world in July to celebrate the night of the raid at Stonewall, which changed everything.
And all of us are created equal. Is the star that guides us still. Just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall.
The Stonewall riots brought attention to the public about the problems with gay mistreatment and equality in society, and how they were not going to take it anymore. Stonewall kindled the nation's gay right movement and is still ever present in society today. With same-sex marriage now legal in this state, we have achieved things we never thought we could thanks to Stonewall.
Okay, so some other terms you'll need to know is are heterosexism, which is a belief system that values heterosexuality as superior to homosexuality and leads to bias against gays, males, lesbians, and bisexuals. Kind of an offshoot of this is heteronormative, which is basically the idea that we perceive heterosexuality in our society as the norm, and so we discuss it as the norm. We make assumptions about people based on heterosexuality being the norm. So, for example, if there's a single man that's in his 20s, someone might come up to him and say, "Oh, when are you going to find a nice lady and get married?" And that's kind of a heteronormative attitude, that just assuming that male is straight when maybe he is gay or bisexual. And so to kind of define those terms as well, there are lesbians, who are women who are psychologically, emotionally, and sexually attracted to other women. Then there are gay men, and these are men who are psychologically, emotionally, and sexually attracted to other men. And so this is defined as your sexual orientation, which is the gender or genders a person is attracted to physically, emotionally, sexually, and romantically. So your sexual orientation could be heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or even bisexual. And so bisexuals are people who are psychologically, emotionally, and sexually attracted to both women and men. And it's helpful to understand this, to think of sexuality as being on a continuum. And so if you look at the screen, you can see on the bottom right corner it says sexual orientation. And so there's a very famous psychologist named Alfred Kinsey who argues, and the idea is well accepted by psychologists and researchers today, that sexual orientation, as well as our gender identity and gender expression and even our biological sex, shouldn't be looked at as this dichotomy, that we either are 100% heterosexual or 100% homosexual, or 100% feminine or 100% masculine, but instead that we all fall on a continuum. And so when you look at sexual orientation like that, it makes sense that bisexuality would be the middle, where there are people who are sexually attracted to both genders. But there's all kinds of different types of sexual orientation. There's pansexuals, for example. There is asexual. So it's not just as simple as heterosexual or homosexual. Sexual orientation, like a lot of things in human behavior, including intelligence, is very dynamic and diverse and complicated, and not this kind of black and white issue as some people would maybe prefer to look at it, because I think it's easier for people to make sense of that way, but it's just not that simple. So we're going to watch a video now on sexual orientation.
Hey everyone, my name is Lacey Green and you're watching D News. Despite the fact that homosexuality is observed in over 1,500 different species in the animal kingdom, there is still a debate amongst the Homo sapiens about whether or not homosexuality is natural. People who think that homosexuality isn't natural think of it as a choice or a lifestyle, that the natural preference is for the opposite sex. Others say that it's not a choice, it's an inherent preference for the same sex, that just like straight people don't choose who they're attracted to, neither do gay people. Science has dug its way into this hot debate. Owing to a few popular studies conducted in the past 20 years, the leading thought is that homosexuality is genetic. It's something you inherit. Although pinpointing a specific gene has been very tricky business. Evolutionarily speaking, gay and lesbian folks are less likely to have children. So how then is it possible for a gene to be passed on to 8% of the population? A new study that came out recently claims to have an answer to this question: epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to a change in how a gene is expressed. The expression is changed not by a change in the DNA sequence, but by other mechanisms, in this case, changing exposure to testosterone in the womb. So to understand this, we ought to back up a little bit. In biology class, you learned that an XX chromosome means that the baby will become a female, and an XY chromosome will develop into a male. But why does XY become a male? Well, because genes on the Y chromosome trigger the release of testosterone, which prompts the development of other male characteristics. Now, during this process, the hormone release is regulated by epimarks, or sex-related genes that are turned on and off to keep male or female development on a steady course, even when hormones are spiking and dipping and all kinds of crazy pregnancy things are happening. This regulation process, called epichanges, controls how masculine or feminine a fetus is. Now, normally epichanges are erased after they're activated. They aren't supposed to be passed on from a parent to a child because they're triggered by the environment. But occasionally, they do pass. And when that child has children of their own, the idea is that child could be gay. Kind of confusing, I know, but basically it's about hormone exposure in the womb that affects sexual preferences in offspring a generation down the line. Now, the study is not conclusive, but it is scientifically significant. We're slowly advancing our understanding of homosexuality, a great evolutionary question. It's also socially significant because one of the main arguments used to justify discrimination against LGBT folks is that they're choosing to be gay, that this is a bad choice, so they deserve to be punished with discriminatory policies. But as this research unravels, we're starting to see that sexual orientation may not actually be a lifestyle choice, that it very well could be an immutable characteristic, something that you can't change, just like your race or your sex. And since we now legally acknowledge that racism and sexism are kind of not okay, maybe society at large can extend that attitude to homophobia as well. In that sense, research like this moves us forward toward a more tolerant and peaceful world. And personally, I kind of get down with that. So guys, let me know what your thoughts are about this development, and hey, make sure you subscribe so that you can get some more D News tomorrow.
So same-sex marriage is legal in our country on the federal level. The Supreme Court voted to legalize same-sex marriage on June 26, 2015. However, there are some states that have opponents to same-sex marriage, and there have been cases of county clerks refusing to give licenses to gay or lesbian couples. So there's still an uphill battle for people that are trying to get married if they're gay or lesbian. And then in terms of having children, there is still a lot of barriers that people that are trying to adopt children have to encounter, and discrimination, even though there are lots of studies that show that gay parents are equally as good of parents as straight parents, that it really has no bearing on the ability to parent. Some people say that they are concerned that if a gay couple has a gay child, that they are going to somehow make that child gay. There's absolutely no evidence of that. Research shows quite the opposite, that the child is going to be whatever sexual orientation they naturally are, regardless of if their parents are straight or gay. And then in terms of cross-cultural attitudes, this discrimination that we see still today in our country towards people that are not heterosexual is evident across all cultures and across all countries. So unfortunately, the bias and the discrimination isn't only true of our country, but many people have negative attitudes towards homosexuality. Some of that is due to certain religious beliefs that homosexuality is a sin or immoral in some way, and churches that are a little bit more progressive in their thinking and have gay clergy members are often ridiculed or face great opposition and resistance from other churches within that religion. Okay, so discrimination is defined as behaving differently, usually unfairly, toward a specific group of people. And discrimination can sometimes lead to hate crimes. And hate crimes are violent crimes such as assault and murder directed towards someone because the victim is of a certain race, ethnic group, religion, or sexual orientation. Some psychologists believe that when it comes to hate crimes against people because of their sexual orientation, it can often be due to homophobia. So homophobia is an irrational fear of homosexual people and strong negative attitudes about homosexuality. And homophobia can lead to hate crimes, verbal abuse, and even physical violence. So there is some psychology behind how homophobia leads to these hate crimes. And a lot of it is suggested by Freud, actually. So one of the leading theories in homophobia is that people that are homophobic to the point where they are verbally or physically abusive towards gay people might have what Freud described as latent homosexual tendencies, which is the idea that people who are unsure of their sexuality see a gay person. It brings up questions about their own sexuality that they're uncomfortable with, and to prove really to themselves that they aren't gay, they resort to these extreme behaviors and kind of look at me and how gay I'm not. I'm going to beat up gay people is sort of the idea. Freud termed this reaction formation, which is a type of defense mechanism in which a person engages in exaggerated behaviors in the opposite direction of their internal urges that they feel to be unacceptable or intolerable. So another classic example of reaction formation is like a little boy who has a crush on a girl, so he pulls her hair. In this version of reaction formation, it is a man who is gay but is uncomfortable with that. And so to prove how gay he's not, he will be violent or abusive towards gay people. So let's go ahead and watch a video now on homophobia.
As the old saying goes, haters be hatin'. Obviously, we'd like to have them knock it off, but science may have provided us with a health bonus for breaking the hate. Hey all you sexual beings out there, thanks for tuning into D News. I'm Trace. Homosexuality and homophobia is a topic of discussion around many a dinner table in the United States and elsewhere, Russia. And though many feel they're in the right on both sides, there's a definite scientific angle to be taken to simply just let the battle go. Let it go. Science says homophobia is killing you. Yeah. To a tune of about 2.5 years of your life. A study done in the United States and published in the American Journal of Public Health wanted to determine whether individuals who harbor anti-gay prejudice experience elevated mortality risk. It turns out, yeah, they do. All things controlled for being equal in their study, people who are prejudiced against the LGBTQ community will die 2.5 years earlier than an equally healthy person of the same age. And sadly, the stress isn't only on the bigots, it spreads to their targets too. Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health completed a separate study which found bisexual, gay, and lesbian individuals living in communities with a high level of anti-gay prejudice had higher mortality as well. They found when controlling for the normal variables of a community, people in the sexual minority died 12 years sooner on average. LGBT people living in high prejudice communities were 3 times more likely to be murdered than in low prejudice communities. That is astounding. A key point in their study was that they assessed the community as a whole rather than the experiences of those individuals. Now, I don't really have a research study to cite, but it seems to me it's rarely only the bigot and their target who are victims of the stresses involved here. The hate is probably felt by their families, their neighbors, and their friends as well, and I wonder what their health effects are. What do you think of this? Have you ever let go of your hate and felt better? Share your experiences with the haters down below in the comments. Your experiences are important. Make sure you subscribe for more, and we'll see you next time on D News.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the process of coming out as the person that you are. And so for some people that are homosexual, actually for the majority of people that are homosexual, at first they may decide to kind of hide that fact, or they're maybe not sure, and so they don't tell their loved ones or people around them about their sexual orientation until they're more comfortable. And when they do talk about it, this is called coming out. So there are some dangers involved in coming out. There's some pitfalls, and there is also some immense joys that result, which include possible ridicule, rejection by peers, family, church. There have been cases of people who have been evicted, denied housing, have lost their job, denial of access to military service, discrimination, physical violence. Many people coming out will never experience these extreme examples I just gave, but the fear of them really takes an emotional toll on people. And study found that teens struggling with coming out are more likely to be depressed, abuse drugs, have eating disorders, and be homeless. But many people that do come out eventually feel a lot more aligned and in balance with themselves and report being better adjusted and mentally healthier. And then in terms of homosexuality and suicide, studies show that gay teens attempt and commit suicide significantly more than straight teens. In fact, gay teens are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than straight teens. And the percentage of teens attempting suicide, gay males is 28% versus straight males at 4%, lesbians at 20% versus straight females at 14%. There is something called gay affirmative therapy, which is counseling that helps individuals accept their sexuality and learn strategies to deal with those in society who harbor prejudice towards them. So for people that are feeling suicidal and are homosexual, gay affirmative therapy is a nice option and an effective option to help them through that tough time. Okay, so now we're going to look at separation and divorce. It can be difficult to know when to end a relationship and when to keep fighting for that relationship. We know that divorce is most common around year 5 of marriage, and or when couples have infants, and or when couples have a teenager is when the most divorces occur. As a side note, it's also more commonly seen that people with female infants get divorced more than male infants. So you can deduce from that whatever you would like. So some of the things to consider when thinking about separation or divorce is, have you gone to individual therapy? Like, have you worked on yourself? Because self-exploration might reveal some issues that you thought were related to your partner, or that you thought weren't fixable but actually are. And then another thing to consider is, have you gone to couples therapy? If both people commit to it, it can actually be very effective. You can learn tools to cope, open up about your concerns in a safe place with a mediator there to help you kind of dive into, what your true feelings are, the root of the feelings, or help you to communicate more effectively with your partner. Another question to ask is, are you both interested in maintaining the relationship? Some people give up hope, they're not interested in saving the relationship, or believe it could work but don't really know where to start. So you need to know where you both stand in terms of saving the relationship before you even kind of venture into trying. And then another thing to ask yourself is, have you had alone time together with your partner to focus on what you want from your relationship? many people that are thinking about separating, they just distance themselves more and more, and spend less time together, because spending time together they feel like reminds them of, the kind of negative place their relationship is in. But actually, it might be helpful to try talking to each other and trying to spend more time to reconnect. And then another question to ask is, what do you think life will look like after the separation? Usually people fall back into the same habits, or they remarry the same type of person. And so that's why we see that the divorce rates for second marriages are higher than first marriages, and then the divorce rates for third marriages are higher than second and first marriages. And usually this is because people don't realize that the problem they're having with the relationship is within themselves. Maybe they're depressed, or they have anger issues, or they're overbearing. And so they need to kind of realize that maybe they are the common denominator in these relationships failing, rather than it always being someone else's fault, and kind of work on themselves. So this slide has tips for how to cope if you decide to end a relationship. You want to allow yourself the time to grieve, express your anger without violence. Try to depersonalize your partner's actions, like not make everything about you. Take responsibility for your part in the relationship not working out. Find a support network, turn to friends and family. Make use of writing in your journal so you can kind of get the feelings that you're having inside out, and that can be very cathartic. Another one is to make amends. So try to forgive the person that you ended the relationship with. Seek closure and learn from the experience. And then finally, learn and love again. So take what you can from that relationship, learn from it, and realize that you will love again and move forward. Okay, so that is it for chapter 7. Don't forget to submit your lecture activities and also complete all of the assignments associated with this chapter, and we will see you for the next one. Have a good day.